Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Welcome to this wonderful project that we all get to do, to Kufa, to Teshuva, a heavenly turn of events. So from the scriptures, the heavens are proclaiming the esteem of El, and the expanse is declaring the work of his hand. In them he set up a tent for the sun. Its rising is from one end of the heavens, and its circuit to the other end. And that is from Tehillim, or Psalms 19, verse 1, verse 4, and verse 6. So we have these words Tekufa and Teshuva. So quite simply, Tekufa's definition is coming round, circuit, a revolution, i.e., of the sun. And Teshuva is return, completion of a year, return of a year, and it's also known as equinox in English. So a simple overview, one-liner that you can use to explain this. The sun travels its Tekufa, or circuit or coming round, along the Mazarot, and Teshuva, or returns to where it arose, which marks the completion of 1 year. So from the scriptures again, the sun also rises and the sun sets and hurries back to the place where it arose, going to the south and turning round to the north, turning, and on its rounds the wind returns. That's from Ecclesiastes 1, 5 through 6. So we can kind of see this language used. We have the sun rising and setting, and it's going back to where it arose. So it's completing that circuit. It's going around, turning on its rounds. And from Psalms also, teach us to number our days. So how do we do that? We mark the shadow that the sun's light creates to determine the sun's location in its circuit, or Tekufa. This helps us know when the covenant calendar year starts, so we can number our days and honor Yahweh's appointed times at the right times, because we know the first month of the next year, we count 14 days, and that's how we number our days. And this is how we determine when the year starts, because as we know, it's not January 1st. So how do we mark? Basically, we just set up a simple sundial experiment. We get a board. I'm going to go through each of those things in this presentation, but quite simply, Yahweh's system for shadow marking consists of these 4 things. We have the earth, which is our physical location, and that's where we see the heavenly bodies, and that's where we set up our sundial experiment. We have the sun, which serves as the object that travels across the heavenly bodies. That is the circuit. And then we have the light from the sun, which creates a shadow from which we mark throughout the day. And then the Mazarot is a map, and that shows us where the sun has gone around and when it has completed that Tekufa circuit. And then we can see that it's made it back to where it arose. That's when we have our Teshuva, or the turn of the year. And the most beautiful thing about this is Yahweh has given us multiple tracking tools to prevent the worship of one part of the system. So we're not looking to the moon, we're not looking to the sun. Actually, we've pointed out this before. When we're marking the sun's shadow, our back is to the sun. So it's very interesting that we have all of these tools to prevent the worship of any one thing. So this is kind of an overview of what we're doing. We have a board. We have a gnomon, which is an object that we use to create a shadow from the sun's light. We have the sun that produces the light. We have the shadow that we mark throughout the day. And when we mark throughout the day, let's say this right here is, 6 in the morning, 7 in the morning, 8 in the morning, etc. When we have the straight line of the marks that we make, then we have the Teshuva. So we mark the tip of the cast shadow throughout the day. And when those markings make a straight line, like it is right here, we have our Teshuva sign. So in this presentation, we're going to answer when to mark the shadow, where to mark the shadow, what to use to mark the shadow, and how to mark the shadow. So when should we mark? We should start practicing today, literally as soon as possible, because it's better to practice before the Teshuva, aka equinox. Everyone lives in different areas, and you will learn a lot. You will learn a lot more from practicing. So it's really important to test your specific area, your specific setup to see what works best for you. That way, you're going to make mistakes, you're going to learn. You can get all of that out of the way before the main event. So when we want to track, we want to track at least once a week leading up to the Teshuva, just so you can test your experiment. So right here, for example, I've got some shadows covering this board, but on this one, I was able to get the sun right there. So just, going over 1 foot, 12 inches right here makes a big difference. So we want to track this setup that we have. We also want to track at least 1 full day the week before, again, for practice, just to make sure our setup is where we want it to be. And then for the week of Teshuva, we want a minimum of 3 days. So we want the day before, the day of, and the day after. This will help us compare the curves that the shadow creates the day before and after so that we can confirm the straight line the day of. Because when we get close to it the day before, the day after, it's going to look very straight until the last marking or the very first marking, depending on where you live. So the day before, the day of, and the day after, that we can compare and confirm that we did indeed see a straight line. Where to track. So you want to put your shadow marking setup on a flat surface. You want to find an area that's free from cast shadows, for example, trees, buildings, these all cast a shadow. This is my mom's front yard. We've got a tree over here in the top right corner. You can see some of the shadows coming in. So I need to be mindful of the times of the day when those shadows are going to be in her yard. And then in the evening, the house is behind, in the back of this picture, it's going to cast a shadow right here as the sun sets in the west over here. So we want to test our location just to see, where we're going to see some shadows, because we don't want that to cover our board. And this area should also be free from interruptions. So people, animals, lawnmowers, etc. We don't want our setup to move throughout the day. So we want to make sure that we can set it up and it's staying in that position all day. This is a picture I took at the park just to give you ideas. So yes, there are some trees, but this is a big open baseball field. So you can set something up there where you're going to get good amount of sun throughout the day. This is another picture at a different park where, this is just cement. It's more like a playground. But, there's lots of different areas where you can go, where you can track if you don't have something that like a front yard or a backyard. So where to track continued, your setup must stay in the same spot unmoved for the entire tracking day. You can move your setup after you collect the data between your marking days, unless you want to mark multiple days on the same board to compare. If you want to have multiple days on the same board to compare, then you would keep the setup unmoved all marking days. If you're not concerned about comparing, you can definitely pack up and bring your stuff inside in between the days after you collect your data. So what materials do we need to track? We will need a board. You can use a foam board, a light colored piece of wood, plastic signage. This I'm going to talk about later. My mom is a dog groomer. This is one of her old grooming boards. A gnomon, which is an object that will cast a shadow. You'll need a fine tip pencil to mark the tip of the shadow. Tiny push pins to mark the tip of the shadow when you're collecting your data at the end of the day. You'll need a camera or a phone to take pictures of your data, and a fine piece of thread, which we will discuss in further detail. Gnomon tips, pun intended. You can use a sharpened pencil. And in this picture, this is a pencil. You can see the tip of the shadow that it creates. A toothpick, which is up here in the right. This is the shadow that it creates. You can use a sewing needle, which would probably be similar to a toothpick. Here's a screw. You can see that it's, coming to a finer point in the shadow in this picture here. We found that 1.5 inches is a good size, and it may prevent ghosting, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And it needs to be stable and not move during the entire tracking day, because this is going to make your tracking more accurate if everything stays in place. So ghosting out you might notice early in the morning and late in the evening if you use a taller gnomon, and even with a shorter gnomon. This is a pretty short screw. This is a sewing needle, and this is a pencil. So by ghosting out, we mean that you can't really tell where the shadow ends. If I go back, you can see more clearly the end of this shadow compared to here in this picture. It's ghosting out. That's the best way to describe it. It's kind of disappearing. You can't really tell where the tip of the shadow is. And we want to make sure that we're accurately marking the very, very tippy top of that shadow. So as I mentioned, it means that this is kind of disappearing slightly, and it's difficult to see where the exact tip is. And this may also happen with taller gnomons, because you'll notice in the beginning, early morning hours, and in the late evening hours that the shadow gets much longer. So it kind of fades out in the end. How to track. So you want to run your board east to west with your gnomon pointing north. Here, this is just an app, the compass app that comes with every iPhone. So you can go from west to east here, and then you have your gnomon at north. You want to get a minimum of 10 hours of tracking each day. That's going to produce the most accurate data. And start as early as you can, as soon as the sun is creating a shadow on your board. Get it as late as you can in the day, before your board is covered in shadows. So as I mentioned, you want to get as early as you can in the morning. And this right here is early in the morning. You can see this is west. So east is over here. This is where the sun is rising. It's hitting the screw, and then it's creating a shadow. So this is the first day, first morning. I think this was about 6:30 in the morning, and it travels pretty quickly, which I'll talk about later, and then kind of curves around. So you want to get as early as you can. This curve is pretty distinct. When you're closer to the Teshuva, it will be less distinct than this. So getting as early as you can is great. You want to also mark solar noon, which is not 12 o'clock noon. Solar noon is different every day. And get as late in the day as you can before your board is covered in shadows. And then you can track once an hour in between. But really, the most important times are early, solar noon, and as late as you can get. And you want to note down the times that you track for each time you mark it. It doesn't have to be with pins. You can use a pencil. Just keep track of the times that you mark. For data collection, we want to know the date that you're marking, your location, state, province, etc., the time zone name or the UTC, total number of shadow markings, the first marking time, the last marking time, and your solar noon time for your location, the height of the gnomon or the object that you're using to cast the shadow, the length from the first marking to the last. Mark north, east, west, and south on the picture that you take or on the board. Use your initials, and we're going to talk about pictures in the next 2 pages, and then you would send them to your team leader. So for data collection for the pictures, we want to take that fine piece of thread that I mentioned, and we're going to connect that thread to the first data point. So you can use a pin like I have here, wrap it around it, and then you're going to pull the thread and connect it to the last data point. So you can wrap it around that pin. Ignore all of the other points in between. You don't need to put pins on these and wrap it around those. The point is, we want to go from first to last, ignoring the rest in between, because this solar noon time is going to tell us if this thread is either on this side, or if it's straight. So you don't want to wrap it around everything else, just first and last, and that's it. The pictures that we need 4 pictures total. So 1 picture of the entire data set, so we can see all data points. That's this big picture right here. 1 picture of the close-up of the first marking. So right here, 7:35 a.m., that was my first marking. Picture of the close-up of solar noon. So 12:56 was solar noon for this day. And this is a close-up again, because you can see the thread is not on this line. You can see the shadow of the thread on this line, but the thread itself isn't on this line. So now we know this day was not a straight line, even though it does look straight. And then 1 picture of the close-up of the last marking of the day. So now I'm going to talk about some things that I've learned just to give you some ideas of your setup and what to do, what not to do. So my first setup was two different boards, different lengths, and a different gnomon. I tested different areas for the cast shadows. As you can see in this picture, this one's covered with shadows, but this one I was able to get some sun from this tree that's, behind it. I learned that a pointy tipped gnomon provides a more accurate mark. Right here is I'm using the top of a screw, but it's hard to tell where to mark for that because you've got the round, and then we thought maybe we'll mark the tip of where it connects to the round, but it's just too much of a guessing game. So a pointy gnomon is going to provide a more accurate tip where you can mark. Larger gnomons, as I mentioned before, may ghost out early in the morning and late in the evening. Just because it's longer, the shadow's longer, it's going to disappear towards the end of it. Taller gnomons will also require a longer board. So as an example, this board is 16 by 16 inches, and I used 1.5-inch gnomon. This board is 48 by 15.5, and I used a 3-inch gnomon. So just this little tiny shadow, even though it's just double in height, it produces more than double of a shadow in comparison. So if you are going to use a larger gnomon, you will need a longer board. Taller gnomons also provide a more pronounced curve. So this curve is pretty noticeable, but the day of the Teshuva, the day before, the day after, it's just a difference of one little point that's going to turn it into a curve versus a straight line. So you will notice that with a taller gnomon, it's more pronounced, the day before and the day of and the day after, you'll be able to notice and confirm it. So if you do want to use a taller gnomon, just be mindful of the ghosting out. You can even see it in this picture. It's kind of disappearing in the end. And you will need a longer board if you choose to use a taller gnomon. And I don't know if you can see this, but let's compare. So this is the top of a screw, which is round, kind of ghosting out right there, but right above the blue. But then the screw, you can see a clear tip. So again, just shows you that a pointier tip will provide a more accurate shadow tip to mark. Some more tips. The shadow will be longest when the sun is rising and setting, again, depending on where you're living. So in this picture, this is the sunrise mark, and this is the sunset mark. And here's the gnomon. So it's much longer in the beginning of the day for me compared to when it's setting. The shadow will also be very close to the gnomon when the sun is directly above it. So this is around noon and solar noon or so. You can tell that the shadow is like right there, right at the tip of where the gnomon is. So just be mindful of how you secure it. This is the first go around. I used tape. That's going to end up moving the gnomon, which you don't want. So just be mindful of how you secure it to your board. Some more tips. Shadow tips are very close to each other day to day. So if you do want to mark on the same board to compare, don't even bother using push pins, just use pencil marks, because you can see right here, day one, this is at 9:44 in the morning with the red one. 10:01, it's pretty, or no, yellow, day two, 9:49. So just 5 minutes and they're already like right next to each other, on top of each other, basically. And then right here is 10:01 where the shadow is here. And so if you're comparing on the same board, definitely just use pencil. Don't use the push pins to compare like I did here, because you will get crowded. And as I mentioned before, just be mindful of how you secure your gnomon, just because those markings around noon and solar noon, and they'll be much closer to the gnomon, especially if you have a shorter gnomon. This is my second setup, and I mentioned before, a dog grooming table with paper taped down to it. I used a rounded top of the screw and a corsage pin for the gnomon. So here's the screw on the end of the table. Here's the corsage pin in the middle of the table. And I had two setups on the same board. I just used a larger and a smaller gnomon. Now, what I learned is taping paper down is not accurate because wind goes under the paper. Even if you tape it down, wind will go under the paper, and that will move the paper. So when you're pressing down to mark, it's going to move the paper, and we need our situation. We need our board and our tracking not to move. So this is going to skew the data because we're not working with something that's accurate because it's moving. I also learned that pointy tipped gnomons work better than a rounded tip. So I mentioned this before that we thought maybe if we use a rounded tip, we can mark right where the pin meets the ball at the top. But as you can see in this picture, there's a lot of ghosting happening and it's difficult to mark. I mean, frankly, even here, it's kind of difficult to tell, but at least there's a point, something better to work with compared to this, because then it's like, do we mark here? Do we mark here? With the tip, you mark at the very, very tip. So a quick summary for the location: must be unmoved and free from cast shadows. Materials: you'll need a flat, lightly colored surface with a pointy tipped gnomon about 1.5 inches to prevent ghosting. When to practice: as soon as possible, but the week of the event, we want to have at least 3 days: the day before, the day of, and the day after Teshuva. 10 hours minimum is excellent, but at least as early and as late as possible, plus solar noon. For the data summary, we need to know the date of marking, your location, time zone, and then put north, west, south, and east on the picture. The details that we need are the total number of markings, the first and last marking time, solar noon time, the length from the first to the last marking, and the height of your gnomon. And for pictures, as you can see here on the left, we have 4 pictures total: the entire marking set, close-up of the first marking, close-up of solar noon, and close-up of the last marking. So from the scriptures again, do not go astray, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no change, nor shadow of turning, from Yaakov or James 1:16 through 17. Now, the most important thing is to have fun. This is a wonderful and fun project. It's very fun, very low effort, very simple to do, but we have a massive, massive impact. We do this so we can number our days and honor Yahweh's Moedim on his time. For resources, if you want a link to this PDF, if you want a link to the videos that we've done, this data collection sheet, you can visit bit.ly/Tekufa. There's a quick overview, simple explanation. Like I said, the PDFs, the videos. I have a 1-page cheat sheet printable. That's basically a summary of this whole thing. Solar noon calculator, UTC and time zone names, and this data collection printable that you see on the screen as well. And if you have any questions, email questions@studythecalendar.com. Thank you so much for watching, and we are so excited to have you part of the Teshuva Shadow Marking Project. Shabbat Shalom.